Good afternoon. Welcome back to the Reactive Church. This is an extra series we've added after Easter because there were so many topics yet to be discussed, we couldn't fit them all into Lent. So rather than this being a Lenten series, we're calling it our Easter lunchtime lecture. But I don't want it to be just a lecture, and I do invite any of you in my live audience here to feel free to ask a question and interrupt and contribute to this discussion. We want to talk today about the way the church reacted to what was essentially a technical and secular opportunity, which was the how to exploit the development of the printing press. Now, the printing press is something that most of us have just taken for granted because it's been around long enough that we just almost cannot imagine what a world would have been like without the printing press. And archaeologists and historians do tell us that there were ways of making books with movable type in the Far East long before there was in Western Europe. But the development of the printing press in Western Europe had a huge impact, far beyond what the Chinese movable print was ever able to achieve. It takes us back to the year 1440 or thereabouts. Several sources I looked at had different dates, but if we want to just think in a general term about 1440, prior to that time, anything that was a book would have been written totally by hand, by a man or a woman with a brush or possibly some kind of a pen, a kind of an ink. It was probably written on vellum, or if you get before into the very ancient Egyptians, they were writing on the papyrus made of the reeds that grew along the Nile. There was a technology for making paper, but since papyrus didn't grow in Western Europe, most of what was written on vellum, tanned leather, stretched very thinly, dried out, and that was the thing. Books were made, but most of the books were not books like we think of now. They were actually more like scrolls. Imagine, if you want to, in a synagogue when they pull out the Torah to read it, and it's got the two axes with the vellum wrapped around, and you would turn like this as you move through the book. 1440, though, changed things. It didn't change as a movement of the church, and so this is why I'm going to say it's a secular technological development, and it's generally attributed to Johannes Gutenberg, who is a German who is at that time living in Strasbourg. Later, he moves back to his hometown of Mainz. And so in Strasbourg and Mainz, they both claim to have been the place where the printing press was invented. The development happened at a time when they didn't really have the industry to support the mass production of books, because until the printing press came, there wasn't a great need for paper industries and ink industries and publishing houses. But with the development of the printing press, all of these things were also quickly developed. Johannes Gutenberg himself died fairly soon after having invented the printing press, and he's not credited with having printed a lot of books himself, but he was very proud of the fact that he was able to print the entire Bible. And imagine all the pages that took, and imagine every letter on every page being hand set into the sheets, which then were inked, put up into the press, the vellum put down, and then the press would be cranked down to where it would touch the paper. They would hold it in place until the ink was set, and then they would crank it back up. It really was a press, not unlike a wine press, where a screw type mechanism is used to bring the top down and crush the thing underneath it, which in this case was the vellum or the paper. He was able to produce not a Bible, but 200 Bibles. Now, according to modern days. When you have a printing press going, I mean, you can get thousands of copies out of a day's work. But the 200 copies that Johannes Gutenberg took him 3 years to print. That's every page of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so this was a vast enterprise and a huge triumph for him to be able to prove the effectiveness that the movable print and the printing press could be a viable economic business. The 3 years to print 200 Bibles sounds like a great effort, but do keep in mind that prior to the printing press, if a Bible was created, it was probably the result of a man giving his whole life to that effort, or a workshop giving the lives of 20 people to that effort for decades. The handwriting of the Bibles was extremely time expensive when it comes to the time and the human effort. For Gutenberg to be able to produce 20 Bibles in just 3 years really got people's attention. And printing presses, not so technologically advanced, were springing up all over Western Europe as everybody saw this is something that they wanted to take advantage of. It wasn't that the book themselves as an art form was considered so valuable. What the development of the printing press actually enabled was the accumulation of wisdom. This is why it was so powerful a tool in changing the world. If you don't have books, or only a few books in the hands of a few people, the vast multitudes of people never had a reason to learn to read, never had a reason to be educated, except maybe in the skills that it took for survival, the farming or the animal husbandry or some skill along those levels. A potter might know how to make pots, but they knew nothing about the other fields of science and technology and the arts and philosophy. Only those who had access to books, and they were such a small number. Most libraries were contained within monasteries or within cathedral chapters. And even those books were considered so rare and so valuable, they were often chained to the bookshelf for fear that someone would come in and steal them. The printing press changed a lot, and it especially changed that. Within just a few decades, enough printing presses were working full-time that cities all over Europe were producing books in many different languages, producing newspapers, producing handouts, posters, and information could be both accumulated by individuals, it could be accumulated by universities, information could be accumulated and spread and dispersed in ways that had never before been possible. 1440 should also key us in on some other things we've talked about earlier. This is the same time period when Western Europe was subject to quite a few epidemics and plagues. And one of the most disastrous things that happened during the epidemics is that the people who knew things died just as much as the people who didn't know things. And before there were mass production of books, there was not a good way of passing the information from one generation to the next. Maybe in a monastery, the older monks could always teach the younger monks. There were the few books and there was a general body of knowledge, but it's not at all uncommon, we are told, that within a monastery, all the monks might die. Can you imagine living in a city where everybody who knows how to read is dead? You know, this caused quite a bit of turmoil, and it caused a breakdown of a lot of structures and authority. Just as we talked about with the rise of the working class from peasants into artisans in the city, because of there weren't enough people to run the farms, and labor was in demand, and they could go make wages in the city. We talked about that on the Reactive Church episode with the epidemics. But it also happens that instead of having 20 monks to produce one Bible, now a single man in a shop with a printing press could produce a lot more work, and information could be gathered. Some scientist knew something. Before he died, he wanted to get it down. He wanted to make sure that it was put to press so that that information could survive him and be passed on to others. But if you're making a press, it's just as easy to make 20, 50, or 100 copies as it is to make one. And so the distribution and accumulation of knowledge is actually the great value of what the printing press offered to people. But like so often with humanity, we don't always use our tools for the best and most noble purposes. Printing press also became a weapon in intellectual and theological warfare. Less than 100 years after the printing of the press, the development of the printing press, Martin Luther begins what we now call the Reformation. And it's not just a coincidence that the Luther Reformation spread so quickly. Luther was quite insightful. And he is famously quoted as having said, I'm trying to use his exact words, well, translated into English. Printing is the ultimate gift of God and the greatest one. The sermons he might preach to his monastery or the sermons he might preach to his followers after the split could now be printed and distributed thousandfold through the cities of Germany and through all Northern Europe. Luther's 95 Theses, when he nailed them to the door, were actually printed out. They weren't handwritten. And within 17 days of the nailing of the 95 Theses, that paper with his thoughts, which began the Reformation, had already arrived in England, and it had been translated and printed out also in English. This would have been unthinkable before the printing press. But with the printing press, it seemed like there was so much more possibility for things. And so the printing press became a great tool in the battle of hearts and minds in what we think of as the Reformation. It springs forth primarily from the fact that those books being printed by Gutenberg were Bibles. And so many people wanted Bibles that became a great and powerful tool for those who no longer wanted to let the church authorities tell them what the Bible said. They wanted to know for themselves. This is one of the great pillars of Protestant reform, is that every person should be able to read the words of God for themselves. And as books became more and more widely printed, more and more widely distributed, more and more people had access to them. They weren't all great interpretations. They weren't all great scholars or theologians. And there was a lot of bad interpretation that came out of some of those Protestant Reformation authors. But that's not really the point. The point is they had Bibles to reference. They no longer had to just follow the teachings of the church as they would be told by the one person who could read, the priest. And in the ability of individuals to have a Bible, read the Bible of themselves, and to think for themselves was just a cataclysmic social change. We have the word for it in Southern Europe. We call this time the Renaissance, which of course means the rebirth. And we often think of it as the rebirth of classical education, but it's also the rebirth of widespread education as books became more accessible and widely available. In Northern Europe, we sometimes use the word the Enlightenment. And we talk about that as being a period where there was intellectual freedom and as if light had been shined into the dark ages. But of course, the original term of the Enlightenment may not have actually had such a philosophical origin, because the printing press and the availability of Bibles and the availability of books not only affected the people's minds and their hearts, but it also affected the way churches operated. prior to the books, you could have a church service in a candle-lit Gothic cathedral, which was basically dark. The colored glass in the windows sifted out much of the light, and it would be twilight at best, even at noonday. But when they started saying, but I can't read my Bible here, it's so dark, there was a movement towards bringing more light into the church, even as the Bible was bringing light into the souls of the readers. And the clear glass architecture of the Renaissance churches and the neoclassical churches that are built after printing press is vastly different from the interior design of the churches before the printing press. It could be just fashion, but maybe fashion was dictated by the needs of the person who says, I want to be able to read my Bible. Now, in the English church, there was a secondary book of great importance that became the object of printing presses all through England. And it was due to the fact that the royal family, the Tudors and the Stuarts, both saw themselves as a unifying force. Remember, they had come to power through the War of the Roses, when there was such a disagreement about who should be the King of England, that the war lasted and devastated England for decades. Henry VIII said his highest priority as a king was to provide an heir so that they would not have to sink back into a renewal of the War of the Roses. His desire for a male heir actually is what's underneath all of his needing so many wives, until he found one that could produce him a male heir. He always blamed the women. You know, they didn't understand quite the biology of how DNA and all these things work. They had this very primitive notion that the seed of the woman would produce the gender of the child, and women who gave birth to girls, you know, it's their fault. And his early queens who gave Mary and then Elizabeth, they didn't provide a boy. He needed a boy. So I don't want to get into all of the Henry VIII and his many wives, but his desire for peace in the country with the production of a male heir went parallel with his production of a common way to worship, so that there would not be a warfare between the Protestants and the Catholics. He charged his Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, to come up with English language worship that all English people could pray together. And that word together is why we call our book Common Prayer. It doesn't mean they're prayers that are written in a common way, but they are meant to be prayed in common with one another. As a community, in communion with one another, they pray in a common way. And to do that, they first got rid of the Latin, which would always separate the educated from the uneducated. And then using the printing press, they were able to make sure that every church in the realm had this format where they could all pray the same in every city, saying the same words as a unification act of loyalty to the church and to the nation. As books of common prayer became more and more distributed, people would bring their books of common prayer to church also. The same way I was talking about needing light to read a Bible, you also need light to read the Book of Common Prayer. And if any of you are book collectors, and I have been over my years, it's easy in antique shops to find these itsy bitsy little prayer books, you know, like this. They're very small. And you open them up and you say, how could anybody read that even in bright sunlight, much less in a darkened church, you know, the print being so small. But the need for light affected the way the churches were built, but the need for common prayer affected the way the liturgies were done. You notice how at Church of the Ascension and at so many other churches, we always have an altar with candles on the altar. And the candles on the altar, some people have spiritualized it into remembering the temple with the high altar and the burning sacrifices. And so we sometimes jokingly refer to people as fire worshipers, that we blow out the candles and then the fire goes out and we know the service is over. And, it's a reference to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, but it was actually much more of a pragmatic thing, that the priest of the altar was the only one who needed to have a book to read from. As long as the priest was reading, everybody else could stand out in the nave and chat amongst themselves. He would ring the bells at the right time saying, okay, the communion is finished. And then it would all turn and pay attention and say, oh, okay, he's gotten that far already? And, but once people were expected to be reading along in their Book of Common Prayer and to be praying communally, then there had to be light distributed through the whole church. We see a lot of the development of chandeliers in churches and the glass windows and people spreading out into the whole church, and then given pews where they could sit because it was much easier to read and to participate in the common liturgy if they were stable and sitting down. Much of what we think of has just been, oh, so normal. This must be the way the church always was. It's totally the production of this change that came with worshiping through books. The English situation, of course, was different because it was one nation already before it tried to reform its church and develop this worship through the development of books. The larger Reformation in Europe took place across many different countries, and there wasn't the same sense of unity. Germany wasn't even a country yet when Luther was, and the German kingdoms and princedoms and duchies, they all differed on their approach to the Reformation, and not all Germans became Lutherans. Lots of German countries and kingdoms remained their Roman Catholic, and being here in Bavaria, we're very much aware of that. Only in England did you have this one nation, one church, one liturgy, one prayer book, this whole approach, and it makes us unique. For others, it was a matter of this is what we believe, and they printed not books of common prayer, but books of catechesis, books of creedal statements, the Augsburg Confession, zum Beispiel, which was printed up and distributed all around. So anybody who didn't want to be Roman Catholic, they had this example. This is what you should believe. And people would sign up, say, yes, we adhere to the Augsburg Confession, or we do not adhere to it. And there was a development of dogmatic and doctrinal statements being printed and published and widely dispersed. And so there are the Western European churches other than England, where they are pretty much organized around doctrine and dogma, whereas the Church of England was not. It was organized around common prayer and commonality of liturgy and worship. The doctrinal statements were not always done peacefully, and this is one of the great causes of the 30 Years' War, is that the inflammatory things being published and printed against the enemy would serve as terrible propaganda, whipping up people into readiness to go off and fight and kill to defend their beliefs, to defend their Lord, to defend their church. They could kill others, in the name of God. And this was enhanced greatly through the use of printing and the pamphleteering and the terrible condemnation that was written. Along with the statements of what we believe, there were also the first attempt of what I might call romanticized fiction. It wasn't yet a novel, but they were false stories being told about the other people's church. There are many stories about the evil nuns cavorting around with the evil monks, convincing everybody that the Catholic monastic system should be torn down. Who knows what's going on in that monastery? They're somewhat interesting to read, but of course, they had very little grounding in truth, and they were intended to inflame and incite and spur on the war. But as the war finally ended, the 30 Years' War settled down, then the printing press took on another important task, and that was the production of materials to spread their own version of whether they were Catholic or Protestant, in defense of their faith and to teach others. I had mentioned very briefly about how you needed books before you needed to know how to read. You have a book in your hand, you want to know what's in it, then you learn how to read. Well, in England, there was a wonderful offshoot we should recognize that comes out of the development of the printing press and the development of a book liturgy. And that's the idea that everybody needs to know how to read. But the working class who came to church, or the children who came to church, and many of whom were still working in factories, they had no opportunity for schooling. And so the Sunday school movement, we should recognize, is connected to this. It wasn't Sunday school like we have it now, where they get together and figure out creative things to do with popsicle sticks to demonstrate Noah and the ark. We often resort to crafts projects and Bible stories and things. But the Sunday school movement, as it actually started, was actually a school teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. Teaching skills, teaching sewing and knitting and quilting, and teaching darning of socks, and teaching metalwork and wood carving. These schools where the church wanted people to be able to feel educated enough that they could then read the prayer books, read the Bibles, and be productive members of a Christian civilization. The printing press, 1440, had changed the world so completely within 100 years that we could never look back to the time of the handmade books being anything other than an art form. In the 19th century, the reaction against the Industrial Revolution produced the arts and crafts movement, and there were many vanity publishing companies that developed their own typefaces and their own parchment papers, and they wanted to make a book that was as valuable as the old monastic handmade books. But of course, it was a niche market. It wasn't ever the way that society was going to head in a mass market kind of way. It was an art form rather than an industrial output. I know there's a lot more that can be said about this, but I'm just opening your minds to the idea that the printing press was not a movement of the church, but the church quickly figured out how to exploit it. Other parts of society did too. I mean, development of businesses and banking and science and all of these accumulation of knowledge, whether it be religious knowledge or not. But the religious accumulation and opinions and openness resulted in both the split of the church, but the strengthening of the individual as someone who could have access to the greatest knowledge there is, the knowledge of God through the Holy Scriptures and through the great thinkers of ages past.